Hey, what is up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. We're in the middle of a short little series on functions, how to write them, and why you might choose one way to write a function over another way. We looked at function declarations last time, which are essentially basic functions, kind of the standard function, where you use the function keyword, you provide a name, you might return something out of that function. So that was the first one we looked at last time. The second one we looked at last time is a function expression, which is where you add the function as a value to some variable. We talked about the difference between them, why you might choose one over the other, and kind of how they operate a little bit differently in JavaScript. Today, we're going to look at arrow functions, and arrow functions are semi-new in JavaScript over the last 5 or 6 years or so, and their basic purpose is to be super compact. So let's kind of work out an example. We're going to start by writing a function expression and then convert it to an arrow function. So let's write one that sums numbers. So we'll say sum numbers is equal to, and we can say function x is the first parameter we'll pass in. The second one will be y, and we can set one of these to a default. So let's say like y is equal to 4 by default, unless you provide something else in its place. Come down here and we can say total or const total is equal to x plus y, and then we can return the total. So let's save this and make sure this is working properly. Say sum numbers and do like 1 and 6. You'll notice there's a little question mark next to that y. That's because I don't have to provide it because I've got a default already. I come in here, it shows 7, and so you can see it's working properly. Now, how do we get this to an arrow function? And what I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and copy this down so you can see the difference as we work. And then let's comment this out just so that we can declare another variable here, a constant variable for some numbers. So the first thing you would do is remove the function keyword. All right, this is step 1. Remove the function keyword and then add a fat arrow. So remove function, add a fat arrow. So step 1 and step 2. The second thing you can do, and this isn't required necessarily for arrow functions, but anytime you can make it more compact, that's kind of the purpose of arrow functions. So what we could do is instead of declaring some variable total and returning it, let's just remove this line altogether and just return x plus y. But there's actually one more step we can do. We can go from an explicit return where we use the return keyword to an implicit return where we don't have to use it and JavaScript just knows we want to return. Now the way you do that, and you can only do this with an arrow function, is to remove the return keyword and then remove the brackets. And you see suddenly we've got a super short little one-liner here. And if I save it, come over here, let's say I change one of these to like, I don't know, 89 or whatever, you can see how it updates automatically. So the steps are remove function, step 1, step 2, add this fat arrow, step 3, make it as compact as possible, and step 4, you can move from an explicit return to an implicit return by removing the return keyword and then removing those curly brackets. Now, there are a couple of gotchas I want you to know. The first is, if you only have one parameter here, you actually don't need these parentheses. So let's say we only had one thing we were passing in. We could just say x plus, let's say this is always going to be 4. Then you don't need these parentheses. Now, let's say you have nothing you're passing in. Well, you might say, well, if I got nothing I'm passing in, I can just do that. But no, it doesn't work like that. So you actually have to have parentheses if you have nothing so that JavaScript knows, hey, I'm not passing anything in here. And then maybe this would be like every time you wanted to sum 5 and 4, which I'm not sure why you'd need that. But if you don't pass anything into an arrow function, you do need these empty parentheses to signal to JavaScript nothing is coming in. If you've got only one thing you're adding in, you can remove the parentheses altogether and it'll work just fine. The next thing to note is you don't want to break this up into multiple lines if you've removed the explicit return. In this case, it would still work fine because x plus 4 it realizes isn't anything, so it's going to tie it together with this line up here. But in some instances, if you break it up into multiple lines, if you've removed that explicit return, it'll actually error out on you. So you just want to make sure you keep it as compact as possible. It doesn't have to be a one-liner. You can add brackets like this, and it'll then know that this is part of this function block. So you can break it up like that. You just want to make sure you've got brackets. So if you've removed the return keyword and tried to make it super compact, just try to keep it on one line and then let it wrap if it needs to in your code editor. Now there are two other things I want you to know about arrow functions, and one is how you might return an object. So I've copied in this code here that creates a new student. And you pass in a first name, a last name, and an age, and then it creates this student object and returns the student to you. And right now it's just written as a function expression. So if I come up here and I can say new student, and I've already kind of pre-done this, so it'll say the new student has a name of Joe Smith and an age of 23. So how might we go about converting this to an arrow function? Well, let's go through our steps. Step 1, remove the function keyword. Step 2, add a fat arrow. Step 3, let's make this as compact as possible. So let's just return the student directly, this object directly, rather than declaring it first and then returning it. And then step 4, if we want to make it really compact, we can put it all in one line and remove that return keyword. Now, there are still brackets, but these are around the object themselves. This is not for the function block itself. Now, if I zoom out so this all shows on one line, you can see it's all there together on one line. If I save it, I'm going to actually get a problem. The reason is this looks, because it's got these brackets, because it's an object, it looks like a function block, and it's not. And so how might you return this? Number one, this is kind of hairy and probably not a super great example because writing it as that function expression is a little clearer anyhow. But when you are returning an object, what you can do is wrap it in parentheses first and then save it here. Then JavaScript understands that you're returning everything here, this object, as part of the arrow function itself, rather than reading the object that's being created as the function block. So if you're returning an object with an arrow function, you want to make sure to wrap it in parentheses. That's the first thing I wanted to tell you. The second thing I wanted to tell you, and let's zoom in a bit more so we can see what's going on here, is I wanted to show you how you might use arrow functions differently based on one key factor, and that is how it interacts with the this keyword. Let's give ourselves a little more space here, and let's talk about the this keyword. Now, the this keyword is an instance, essentially refers to the instance of some object. With arrow functions, however, it's scoped to its own parent. Now, if that's confusing, let me show you an example. We've got this button over here, and let's go ahead and just declare it as a variable here. So we'll say const button document.querySelector, and we're just going to grab the button tag itself, and let's console log the button just to make sure everything is working properly. All right, this is our clickety-clackety button. Perfect. All right, now we might write like an event listener on this. So we can say add event listener, and we could say on click, we're going to tell the browser to run a function. And we'll just call this inactivate. All right, something like that. Now up here we need to, before we do too much, we need to actually write the function. So we could first of all write this as a function expression. Say const inactivate is equal to function, and then we're not going to pass anything in here because we're going to use the this keyword. So whatever's been clicked, this refers to its own object. The object itself, this .classlist .add, and then you could add a class inactive, which I've already written up. It basically just makes it go to display none. So if I save this here, come up here and I click, that should make it just remove itself automatically because it's referencing itself with this keyword. Now in this instance, I think it would be best to actually pass in the event itself and then use like event.target or something like that, but you get the point. You can use the this keyword to reference the object that the function is run on. Now if I were to take this and let's jump down here and let's call this inactivate2, and let's go ahead and convert this to an arrow function. All right, go ahead. If you want to pause the video, see if you can do this yourself, and then join me back in a second. Okay, hopefully that was the time of your life. Come back here, let's remove a few things. We can pull this all up on one line. And let's see, we need to add a fat arrow. I skipped a step, sorry about that. And we can actually remove these brackets as well. If I come in here, you might say, okay, that's good, and it is. But let's go ahead and click, and you're gonna see that we get an error because it's trying to add a class to something that says it's undefined. All right, so let's see what's going on here. So the first thing let's do, let's just kind of, let's copy this down and then comment this out. And let's, first of all, console log this. Let's see what we're getting when we click on it. So if you click here, you'll see that we're not getting the button itself, we're actually getting the window. If I switch this inactivate back out to inactivate2, console log this, and I click again, it will remove it, but it's also going to give me this referencing its own object, the button itself, the thing that was clicked. So arrow functions treat this keyword differently. They scope it to the parent, which in this case is the window itself, rather than the object. Now you can actually use this to your advantage. So let's write one more function to show you how that might work. Let's say I've got a function expression here, and we're going to call it change button text. And this function says this.style.transform is equal to, first of all, I want to just say I want to change the scale to 2. And then let's change this down here to change button text. And you'll notice when we're writing these event listeners, I'm not actually running the function like this. I'm actually just referring to it and telling the browser to run it itself. So that's the difference between those two. But if I come in here and I click, you'll see it gets bigger. All right, perfect. All right, we haven't done anything yet. How can we use the this keyword differently? Well, let's say we wanted to, after a certain couple of seconds, or maybe even just really quickly, we wanted to scale it back down. So to do something after a little bit, you use the set timeout. And you need to provide two things, a function and then a number of milliseconds. So we could write this as a traditional function. We could say function, and then in here we could say this dot style dot transform. Let's just copy this down rather than retype everything. And we could change the scale back to 1. And then down here we need to provide a number of milliseconds when this will do it. So if I hit save and I come over here and click, after 1 second it should go back down, but it doesn't. And that's because it's trying to transform this that's scoped to this function block right here, rather than the thing that was clicked on, because remember, this is scoped to the function that is written in normal functions. So here's a perfect use case for an arrow function. To make this even more clear, let's come in here and say console log this, and we could say, maybe let's do this. Let's do inside, and then this, and then let's copy this down, and we're going to say outside this. Okay, so if I come in here and I click, inside gives me the object, the HTML button, and the outside is giving me the object of the window. So you can see the difference between those two. Now, what we could do is convert this to an arrow function. So let's remove that. Even though we're not passing in a parameter, remember we need to have those parentheses if we don't pass in anything. I could come in here. Let's not worry about removing the actual curly brackets. This will work just fine. Now if I come in here, this of the arrow function will now be scoped to the parent function up here. So if I click, it'll now reference that and it should jump right back down. And you'll see as well, these console logs tell me that when I clicked on this function here scopes this to this function. And remember, because this is an arrow function, that this keyword is scoped to its parent, here the function up above. So you can use this keyword and how it interacts with arrow functions to your advantage to kind of reference things outside of your own function when you need to. I realize that this is kind of an opaque thing. You might say, I'm not sure how I'd use that yet, but just keep that kind of in the back of your mind, because that's one of the main differences when you might reach for an arrow function. So the two reasons I would reach for an arrow function are what I just showed you, that this keyword, or secondly, just to make things way more compact. Typically, I usually use arrow functions in callback functions, which we'll talk about next time, or just want to need a quick little one-liner to like add a class or something like that, and I don't want to make it some huge function. Just a quick one-liner is a great use case for an arrow function. Hopefully this was helpful and gave you some kind of got-yous when it comes to arrow functions. And the next video, we'll look at a few other ways to write a function when you might choose one over the other. All right, thanks so much for watching, and happy coding.